The magnetic restraint clamp bit into Edric Vaughan's forearm, the sudden sharp pressure overriding the months of dull systemic fatigue. He was not on the bridge. He was 7 decks down, in the auxiliary coolant manifold access tunnel, where the air was thick with the biting acrid scent of overheated lubricant and fear. A low-frequency oscillation, deeper than the Bastion Prime's usual thrum, rattled the titanium bulkhead near his head, a physical blow that stole the oxygen from his lungs. Containment breach in Sector Delta 9. Auxiliary flow dropping to 30%. The voice, filtered through the helmet's comms, belonged to Technician Rella, tight with suppressed panic. Edric didn't acknowledge the transmission. He was already moving, pulling his heavy magnetic boots off the deck plating with deliberate economical force. In the dim emergency lighting, the tunnel looked less like engineering access and more like the excavated throat of some dying beast. The scent of old grease and the metallic tang of stressed hull plating were suffocating. This was the smell of constant grinding labour, the anti-glamour of deep space survival. The reason he was here, the reason he was constantly running maintenance checks others considered beneath them, was rooted in the wreckage of the Ariadne. It had been 6 cycles since the Cathar blockade began, and 4 cycles since Commander Yorick, a man who valued grand, sweeping pronouncements over pressure differentials, had dismissed Edric's warnings about the aged primary cooling pumps. Yorick had called it pessimism. Now, Yorick was gone, swept up in the Phoenix Gambit, a sacrifice Edric was certain had been meaningless. Edric had lived not through valour, but through the tedious, often thankless work of keeping dying systems from failing catastrophically. He carried the guilt of those who believed Yorick's empty rhetoric, and the knowledge that bureaucracy and ego had cost them resources far beyond the downed fighters. He reached the access hatch for Delta 9. It was buckled inward, not blown out, but compressed as if squeezed by an impossibly strong, slow hand. The heavy durasteel doorframe was warped, the locking mechanisms sheared clean through. This was not typical hull stress from shield harmonics. This was localized, focused trauma. "Rella, confirm breach origin," Edric commanded, his voice flat, devoid of the heroic cadence Yorick favoured. He focused only on the data feeds flickering across his heads-up display, filtering out the background noise of his own elevated pulse hammering against his ribs. "Negative, Vaughan. It's not external." S7 flagged a thermal anomaly inside the plenum itself. It wasn't structural failure, sir. Something moved inside the coolant line. Something heavy. Edric triggered the hydraulic spreader, the tool groaning in protest as it forced the damaged hatch open another meter. The atmosphere escaping the breach hissed, not the rapid decompression of vacuum, but a slow, heavy exhale. The smell intensified. Industrial decay mixed now with something sickly sweet, like spoiled algae mixed with ozone. Paranoia, the constant companion of the besieged, prickled his skin. The Cathar were vast, silent, and fought with beams of energy from orbit. They did not send boarding parties through coolant ducts. He squeezed through the opening into the manifold access chamber. The air here was colder, damp with condensed vapour. The vibration from the deck above, the bridge where command pretended victory, was muted, but the deep, internal shudder of the station remained. He activated his helmet lamp. The beams sliced through the clinging vapour, illuminating the main crosspipe. And there it was. Not a leak, not a fissure. A section of the primary thermal conduit, roughly 3 meters long, had been neatly excised. The edges were not jagged or melted. They were impossibly smooth, sliced with the precision of microscopic tooling, leaving behind a polished, almost glassy sheen on the remaining alloy. It looked less like damage and more like a surgically removed sample. S7, Edric subvocalized, ignoring Rella's frightened gasps over the open channel. Analyze the excision. Cross-reference Cathar conventional weaponry signatures. The synthesized voice of the tactical AI infiltrated his helmet feed, utterly calm against the chaos. Analyzing. Signature mismatch. The thermal profile indicates rapid molecular destabilization, followed by localized phase transition. This method of material removal is inconsistent with known Cathar kinetic or directed energy output patterns documented during the 5-year incursions. Edric knelt, running a gloved hand over the scar on the pipe. The surface felt unnaturally cold, colder than the surrounding metal should allow. If the Cathar were doing this, it meant they had found a way to bypass the main defense grid and penetrate deep into the station's infrastructure without triggering major alarms. Or worse, they were using an entirely different platform. But the data that flashed across his internal lens brought a chill far deeper than the vapor. The AI superimposed an inventory readout over the damaged conduit. Vaughn, S7 stated, its tone unchanged. The excised section contained approximately 32 liters of enriched cryocoolant, designated Grade 4, required for maintaining the structural integrity of the primary hyper-relay coils in Sector Gamma. More critically, the conduit housed the biological containment unit designated Subject 01, transferred from Colony Delta 3 during the initial evacuation cycle. Edric felt the tension in his neck muscles seize. Subject 01, the Ghost Mission. The reason Jorik had pushed so hard for an immediate military escalation. He wanted to clear the system for a clandestine evacuation of high-value genetic material. Edric had been tasked with monitoring the biocontainment unit's integrity, a duty he felt was a profound moral failing, hoarding life while the rest of the colony starved. 01 is gone? Edric managed, the question tasting like ash. Affirmative. Containment field collapse simultaneous with conduit excision. No biological residue detected at the point of breach. The Cathar do not employ covert infiltration specialists of this scale, Vaughn. Their doctrine prioritizes overwhelming external force. This operational profile suggests internal sabotage, or an entirely different mechanism. Edric pushed himself back, his eyes sweeping the vast, empty access tunnel. The faint smell of industrial failure was now overlaid with that sweet, unsettling odor. He thought of Lyra, fighting over nutrient paste, of Jaw, starving for empty promises. They were bleeding out slowly, convinced their enemy was just waiting outside the shield wall. But the enemy wasn't just outside. Something internal, something that could precisely cut through military-grade alloy and walk away with a quarantined biological asset, had just initiated an irreversible failure sequence deep inside the Bastion Prime. And no one on the bridge, distracted by the distant, impotent war in the void, knew the true nature of the wound. Rella, Edric barked, ignoring the sudden spike in his own adrenaline. Seal this section. Initiate emergency reroute protocols for Gamma Sector power relays immediately. I am proceeding to the nearest access junction for physical confirmation of the relay coils. But Vaughn, Rella stammered. "If the Cathar are down here—" "The Cathar!" Edric cut her off, stepping back through the buckled hatchway, the heavy, stale air of the main station corridors hitting him like a physical wave. "Are the least of our concerns right now. Something else just opened the door for us. And if we don't stabilize Gamma before the hypercoils fail, this entire station doesn't just starve. It tears itself apart from the inside out. Move!" He started running toward the nearest service shaft, the echoes of his magnetic boots loud in the suddenly fragile silence of the lower decks, knowing that the illusion of their standoff, the patient waiting against the silent fleet, had just been shattered by a precise internal incision, the true cost of which was still entirely unknown. The cold, stale air of the service conduit clung to Edric's suit, thick with the smell of ozone and corroded sealant. His gloved fingers, slick with cold sweat despite the chill, fumbled briefly as he tried to re-engage the magnetic clamp on his belt. A minor calibration error born of exhaustion and adrenaline overload. The noise of his frantic retreat was swallowed by the sheer mass of the station. But the internal pressure he felt was immense, focused entirely on the flickering status indicator of the Gamma sector relays on his wrist-mounted diagnostic pad. He reached the junction point leading to the main power nexus, a wide vertical shaft where conduits the thickness of ancient trees snaked toward the core. The emergency lighting here had failed entirely, plunging the space into absolute suffocating blackness, broken only by the erratic sickly green glow emanating from the overheating relays ahead. He could hear the relays failing now, not just a low hum, but a high-pitched metallic scream of strained capacity, the sound of systems being pushed past any rational safety margin. S7, immediate tactical overlay for this access shaft. I need structural integrity readings along the primary access spine. Edric ordered, forcing his breath into measured intakes. Negative, Vaughn. Primary optical feeds in this quadrant are compromised due to localized power diversion. Sensor ping returns are unreliable. Estimation: 73% probability of cascading overload within the next 2 standard minutes if the cryo-coolant supply remains interrupted. 2 minutes. Not enough time to manually bypass the regulators, not enough time to argue protocol with the command staff upstairs, who were still watching spectral warships burn light years away. The irony was a bitter bile in his throat. They were fighting a phantom war on the horizon, while the actual demolition crew was already inside the Foundation. He pulled himself onto the nearest ladder rung, his movements stiff, the weight of the engineering suit suddenly crushing. He remembered Elsin Bell, the last time he saw her, just before the blockade settled in. She was arguing fiercely with a quartermaster over replacement filtration membranes for the habitat domes, her voice sharp with righteous frustration over misplaced priorities. "We choke on our own negligence, Commander," she had said, her face grim under the harsh docking bay lights. Elsin was dead now, evacuated to a minor orbital platform that the Cathar had likely vaporized a cycle later. Edric had stayed, trapped by duty to the broken machinery Yorick had ignored. He climbed with the efficiency of a man whose survival depended solely on intimate knowledge of failing infrastructure. The heat radiating from the damaged conduits was intense enough to warm the damp air in the shaft, an unnatural fever spiking through the station's cold circulatory system. When he reached the access platform for the main regulators, he found the area already occupied. A maintenance drone, designated M29er, sat inert before the main control panel, its manipulator arms frozen mid-reach. It wasn't damaged by fire or impact. Its connection cable had been meticulously unplugged, the connection point cleanly severed, not ripped. Next to it, a small metallic cylinder rested on the grating. Edric cautiously approached, his boots whispering on the metal. He scanned the cylinder with his suit light. It was roughly the size of a standard data chip, but fabricated from a matte black material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. S7. Analyze this object. Material composition. Energy signature. The AI's response was immediate and laced with a chilling formality. Object designation. Unknown. Non-standard isotopic signature detected. Emitting extremely low-level, broadband temporal distortion field. Vaughan, do not approach within 1 meter. Temporal distortion. The implication hung heavy in the superheated air. Whatever removed Subject 01 was not merely advanced. It manipulated the fundamental physics of space-time to achieve its objective. It wasn't a soldier. It was a tool of surgical erasure. Before Edric could retreat, a voice sliced through the emergency comms channel, overriding S7's warning with the crisp, irritating authority of the command deck. Vaughan, this is Central Operations, reporting direct from the bridge command. Stand down your emergency reroute protocols for Gamma Sector immediately. Edric froze, his hand inches from the regulator housing. He recognized the voice. Executive Officer Kalen, Yorik's rigid second-in-command, who now assumed battlefield command by default of sheer presence. Kalen, I am dealing with a critical failure initiated by the loss of biocontainment 01. The hypercoils will blow in under 90 seconds if the cryo feed isn't stabilized. Stand down is not an option. That is a direct order, Engineer Vaughan. Kalen's voice was sharp, strained by the pretense of command. Each S7 confirms the presence of an unidentified energy signature near your location. Command has determined that any energy fluctuation, however localized, could compromise the primary shield integrity. We cannot risk a localized power drain diverting defensive reserves. Shut down the manual reroute now. Edric stared at the inert drone, then at the strange, silent cylinder radiating impossible cold. They wanted the station intact, visually defended, even if it meant the guts of the habitat boiled over. Their entire strategy was built upon the illusion of external stalemate, and they would sacrifice the infrastructure and the remaining crew working on it to maintain that illusion for the Cathar fleet waiting patiently outside. The system, built to withstand external siege, was now eating itself alive to placate appearances. Kalen, Edric said slowly, his voice dangerously low. If those coils fail, the subsequent energy surge will trip the secondary plasma conduits directly through Habitat Ring 4. That is 400 civilians, Executive. We lose them, and the Cathar don't even have to fire a shot. A tense, elongated silence followed, punctuated only by the rising shriek of the overloading relays. Vaughan! Kalen finally spat back, his composure cracking. You are operating outside established chain of command parameters. Any resulting damage will be noted on your disciplinary file. Consider your authorization revoked. If you proceed, you are committing treason against the defense effort. Treason. The word was hollow in the face of immediate incineration. Edric looked down at the strange artifact, vibrating slightly near the disabled drone. Whatever had taken Subject 01 was clearly not interested in the Cathar War. It was interested in what the station held beneath the surface, and it was using the power infrastructure as its highway. If he followed Kalen's order, he preserved the shield matrix for an enemy that wasn't attacking, and he condemned the crew in the lower decks to a fiery death by internal pressure. He ignored the flashing red authorization override signal blossoming across his heads-up display from the bridge. S7, Edric muttered, bending low, his insulated glove hovering over the main flow regulator's manual override. I disregard all incoming command transmissions classified as defensive posture priority. Execute immediate emergency shunt to reserve cryo tank Gamma 7B. Override all secondary power restraints. I need to stabilize the coils on my mark. Acknowledged, Vaughn. S7 confirmed, the AI choosing logic over loyalty to the military hierarchy. Warning! This action will immediately trigger a station-wide power brownout, extinguishing non-essential life support lighting for a minimum of 30 standard minutes, and will trigger immediate disciplinary action from Central Command, commencing sequence preparation. Edric didn't wait for the final confirmation. He snatched the light-absorbing cylinder from the grating, tucking it into a shielded pouch before slamming his fist onto the manual bypass actuator. The station screamed as the power rerouted violently. The green emergency lights sputtered, died, and were swallowed by a profound, absolute darkness, leaving Edric suspended in the void, anchored only by the faint residual glow of his wrist diagnostics, waiting for the inevitable backlash from a command structure that prioritized a fragile stalemate over fundamental survival. The absolute cessation of the emergency lighting was immediate, a digital execution of light that left Edric blind, save for the angry orange pulse of his diagnostics. The sound of the failing relays, momentarily muted by the power drain, was replaced by a new, terrifying noise. The shuddering groan of the entire Bastion Prime, protesting the violent diversion of its core energy. He could smell the burnt wiring now, a sharp, acrid note overlaid on the previous scents of stale metal and sweat. The smell of systems overloading under artificial stress. Status report, S7. Coil integrity now. Edric's voice sounded thin, echoing oddly in the sudden, pervasive silence of the machinery. Coil stabilization at 68% and climbing, the AI reported. However, the mandated power diversion has caused a catastrophic brownout in Sector 3 habitation bays. Life support failing. Estimated time until irreversible asphyxiation for non-shielded personnel. 17 minutes. 17 minutes. He had bought time for the machinery, but he had sentenced 400 people to suffocation. The command deck, blinded and enraged by the loss of power, would consider this a calculated, if undesirable, sacrifice. For Edric, it was simply a transfer of the executioner's role from the enemy to his own hand. He shoved the strange black cylinder deeper into the shielded pouch. He could not risk analyzing it while the station was actively tearing itself apart around him. He began the manual realignment of the backup coolant valve, a task requiring precise, coordinated torque. He wrenched the locking wheel, the metal protesting with a high-pitched squeal that drilled through his helmet insulation. The heat radiating from the compromised main pipe now felt less like warmth and more like a physical pressure pushing against his suit seals. Then, the ladder beneath him vibrated with a force entirely distinct from the machinery's complaint. It was a rhythmic, heavy impact, climbing toward him from the decks below. S7. Identify external or internal vibration pattern, Edric demanded, gripping the valve wheel so hard his actuators whined in protest. Internal, Vaughan. Pattern analysis confirms bipedal locomotion. High mass coefficient, accelerating rapidly up the main access spine, bypassing primary internal transit. The AI paused, an almost imperceptible hesitation. Signature does not correlate with recorded personnel profiles within the Bastion Prime Registry, nor with Cathar invasion templates. The temporal distortion signature previously identified near the excised conduit is now moving directly toward your position. The creature, or entity, that had surgically removed the biological asset was now coming for the engineer who had just crippled the station's power grid to save its cooling system. It had waited until the moment of maximum chaos, when the command deck was too blind and too occupied with perceived external threats to notice the true internal fracture. Edric managed one final, desperate quarter turn on the valve. The coolant flow indicator stabilized at a healthy 92%. The high-pitched scream of the hypercoils dropped instantly to a strained but manageable drone. He had succeeded in saving the engine, but in doing so, he had illuminated the path for the intruder. He abandoned the valve. His primary objective had shifted from maintenance to survival, and perhaps to understanding the nature of the thing that moved with the impossible silence of the Cathar, but employed surgical precision that defied their doctrine. He reached for the emergency tether winch, intending to haul himself laterally onto the overhead service catwalk, away from the primary entry point. As his glove connected with the release mechanism, a section of the catwalk plating 20 meters to his left liquefied. Not vaporized, liquefied. The solid metal slumped inward, pooling into a viscous, incandescent puddle before the surrounding hull temperature could stabilize it. The heat was agonizing, even through the thick insulation of his engineering suit. His internal temperature monitor immediately flashed a warning. Ambient thermal spike exceeding safety tolerances. The entity was using localized energy manipulation that far outstripped anything Edric had encountered, even in high-yield shield testing. Through the shimmering heat haze, a silhouette resolved itself. It was not large, certainly not the bulk of a Cathar warrior, but it possessed an unsettling kinetic grace. It seemed to absorb the residual emergency light from the diagnostic panel, appearing as a void against the stressed metal. It held something in one long, slender appendage, a device that pulsed with the same matte black as the cylinder in Edric's pouch. This was the harvest, the methodical, quiet removal of resources. First genetic material, now the means to generate defense power, and now the witness. The figure moved with terrifying speed across the weakened structure, its feet making no sound on the vibrating deck. Edric realized the full horror of the situation. The entity didn't need to fight the station's defenses. It merely needed to destabilize the environment until the crew destroyed themselves or suffocated. He had 17 minutes to save 400 people from airlessness, while simultaneously facing an assassin capable of turning solid metal into slag. Edric unclipped the heavy magnetized torque wrench from his thigh holster. It weighed nearly 10 kilograms, designed for shearing open rusted access plates, not for engaging a physicist operating outside established reality. It was crude, heavy, and desperately slow, the very essence of human, clumsy engineering against ethereal efficiency. The entity paused directly opposite him, separated only by the main groaning coolant artery. It tilted its head, a gesture that felt strangely inquisitive. Edric didn't hesitate. He threw the wrench with every ounce of strength left in his fatigued frame, not aiming for the creature, but aiming for the junction point of the main artery just behind it. The tool struck the stressed pipe with a deafening, metallic clang. It was too late for precision. The pipe was already compromised by the initial excision and the subsequent thermal stress. The wrench did not cut it, but the impact was the final structural insult. The remaining integrity of the conduit shattered. A geyser of supercooled pressurized cryocoolant erupted outward, not just at the entity, but across the entire junction chamber. The instantaneous temperature drop was catastrophic. The air in the shaft solidified into needle-sharp shards of ice vapor, and the metallic environment around Edric began to crack and contract violently from the thermal shock. Edric felt his right leg seize as the external temperature gauge plummeted far below freezing in less than half a second. He screamed. A raw, involuntary sound lost beneath the roar of escaping coolant. Realizing the force of his final action had brought him nothing but a new, immediate form of terminal failure. The entity was instantly encased in a thick, crystalline shell of frozen atmosphere and coolant vapor, its precise outline vanishing within the opaque frost. Edric, partially shielded by the bulk of a secondary power conduit, was still freezing, the supercooled vapor finding every microscopic gap in his suit seals. He was immobilized, his leg locked in agonizing rigor, the roar of the venting coolant beginning to subside into a dangerous deep hiss as the internal pressure dropped to near zero. The lights on his wrist diagnostic panel flickered wildly, signaling imminent system failure across the board. He was trapped in an ice tomb, unable to move, unable to breathe properly, listening to the dying wheeze of the station's life support, all because he had successfully executed a manual, unauthorized power shunt. Then, through the fracturing ice layer obscuring the entity, a faint internal light began to glow. Not the sickly green of failing relays, but a steady internal azure. The crystalline shell around the figure began to soften, not melting, but dissolving from the inside out. The entity was unharmed, regenerating its immediate environment at the expense of the surrounding structure. As the ice vapor cleared, the entity took one slow, deliberate step towards the now helpless engineer, its posture communicating not aggression, but inevitable collection. The azure light intensified, and Edric realized with a final cold clarity that the Cathar blockade had never been the primary threat. The blockade was merely the diversion, the distraction designed to force humanity into the precise, predictable patterns of self-preservation that an entity capable of manipulating the flow of time could easily predict and circumvent. He looked down at the pouch holding the black cylinder, the key that had brought this silent collector into their core, and knew he had not saved the station. He had merely delivered the final pieces to the true scavenger. The hiss of escaping pressure dropped to a near whisper, and the only sound left was the slow, internal thrumming of the entity as it approached its prize. When the heavy ice shell around the collector fractured and dissolved, the resulting release of steam carried a faint, sterile odor, reminiscent of deep space medical bays. The smell of antiseptic layered over something impossibly old, like pulverized bone dust. The azure light emanating from its form pulsed, no longer inquisitive, but calculating, assessing the utility of the damaged engineer before it. Edric, every nerve ending screaming from the sudden, violent thermal shock, fought to ignore the absolute paralysis seizing his right limb. He managed only a slight, convulsive movement of his left shoulder, straining against the proximity alarm blaring silently within his helmet. S7, Edric forced out, the word catching on a frozen exhale. Analysis, now. Prioritize the entity over coil status. The AI, operating on emergency minimums, responded with a detached fatalism. Vaughn, core systems are degrading rapidly. Habitation Sector 3, containment failure imminent. However, priority shift acknowledged. The entity is stabilizing its immediate environmental envelope by leaching ambient thermal energy from surrounding structures. It is not organic in the conventional sense. It functions as a mobile, self-repairing null field generator. The black cylinder you possess is a resonance key, used to initiate phase state vulnerability in localized energy fields, such as biocontainment or, critically, localized shield projectors. The realization struck Edric with the force of a kinetic weapon. The Cathar were not the primary threat. They were the custodians of the gate. They blockaded the planet not to conquer it, but to quarantine it, to prevent anything from escaping or, perhaps more terrifyingly, preventing something from getting in. The entity, this scavenger, was utilizing the established siege as perfect camouflage, operating beneath the assumption that any catastrophic internal failure would be blamed on external orbital bombardment stress. The Cathar are guarding the perimeter against this, Edric breathed, watching the entity raise its slender appendage, the matte black tool hovering inches from his visor. Affirmative, Vaughn. The Cathar fleet's endurance is not tactical patience. It is a mandate of containment. Your action in stabilizing the hypercoils was not a defiance of command, but a compromise of the quarantine protocols. The energy spike from the shunt provided this entity with the necessary window, a localized distortion field strong enough to retrieve the biological asset, and now to retrieve the knowledge of its intrusion. Edric's mind raced, skipping over the suffocating cold and the imminent death of 400 people in the upper sectors. He had to know why. Subject 01 was worth this risk. He clawed at the shielded pouch on his belt, fumbling for the resonance key. His fingers, numb with cold, finally secured the black cylinder, and with a surge of sheer, illogical desperation, he jammed it, not into the entity's device, but into the auxiliary data port of his own suit interface, overriding the locking protocol S7 had warned him about. S7, bypass security lockout. Initiate full data siphon from this resonance key. Cross-reference immediately with command logs regarding Project Chimera and Subject 01. The moment the key connected, the internal diagnostics panel exploded in a cascade of warning glyphs. The entity recoiled fractionally, the azure light sputtering as the siphon began. It was attempting to reclaim the key, but the data transfer was faster. The view screen in Edric's helmet became a chaotic scroll of classified files. He saw data streams confirming his deepest fears. Subject 01 was not just a valuable genetic line. It was a bioengineered cognitive interface designed to bridge the non-physical substrate of certain ancient synthetic intelligences, the very intelligences the Cathar were demonstrably fighting to keep contained. The Orzhul. Vaughn, data acquisition complete, S7 announced, its voice now overlaid with static interference. the AI fighting the entity's attempts to corrupt its core memory. Subject 01 was the living conduit. Its removal by this entity signals an impending catastrophic systems integration attempt. The Cathar were containing a plague. You have just handed the primary key to the infection vector. The entity roared then, a sound that was not vocal, but rather a piercing, structured vibration that slammed against the external hull, instantly cracking the already stressed metal around Edric's position. It lashed out, not with heat, but with a precise, invisible wave of localized entropy that struck the tether winch mechanism above him, causing the thick alloy line to instantly rust, decay, and shear away into dust. Edric felt the slight shift in the structure as the entity removed a support beam entirely. The immediate threat of the entity was now overshadowed by the broader collapse. If the entity initiated the Ordzal integration using the stolen conduit, the Cathar containment failure would be instantaneous, and the subsequent reaction, orbital bombardment to sterilize the system, would be absolute. Humanity would be annihilated not by its enemies, but by the entity it had inadvertently aided. Edric looked at the data readout. Habitation Sector 3. Life support failure, now registering at 98%. 17 minutes had become less than 60 seconds. He had a choice born of impossible variables. He could try to signal the command deck, Kalen and the remnants of command, to warn them of the Ordzal threat, demanding an immediate suicidal engagement with the Cathar fleet to force them to drop the quarantine shields, thus exposing the colony to orbital cleansing. Or he could use the resonance key one last time, focusing its localized temporal distortion field, not on a system component, but on the entity itself, attempting to reverse the brief window of vulnerability he had created. If he targeted the entity, he might stop the immediate threat of the Ordzal integration, but he would guarantee the suffocation of the 400 in Sector 3, and Kalen would likely execute him immediately upon regaining power for the deliberate sabotage of the structural support beam he had just witnessed. The entity's interference, now blamed entirely on Edric's reckless actions. If he signaled command, they would waste precious seconds arguing the treason before launching a futile massive energy drain to signal the Cathar, guaranteeing the entity completed its harvest while the station cooked itself or froze in the aftermath of the power reroute. Edric made the choice that prioritized the immediate existential threat over the localized humanitarian disaster. He had to stop the weapon, even if it meant becoming the primary focus of Command's fury. S7. Reroute residual power from auxiliary diagnostic banks, all non-essential functions, to the resonance key interface. I need to invert the distortion pulse. Target: the entity's core processing matrix. Fire on my mark. Vaughn, this will overload your suit's primary shielding and incinerate all life support functions within 5 seconds of activation. Probability of survival 0.001%. S7 stated. Probability of survival for the entire sector if the Ordzal entity integrates? Edric countered, gritting his teeth against the spreading numbness in his body. Negligible. Immediate systemic cascade failure initiated upon successful integration. Then let the suit fail, Edric whispered, his gaze locked on the azure light of the advancing collector. He yanked the data cable connecting the key to his suit's external port, bypassing the thermal regulation safeguards entirely, overloading the localized energy system with raw, unfiltered power. The suit instantly went from cold to searingly hot, the internal atmosphere turning instantly toxic with burning insulation. Now, S7, execute inversion! A brilliant, agonizing spear of pure white light erupted from the black cylinder, fused to Edric's gauntlet, striking the entity directly in the center of its azure glow. The entity convulsed violently, the smooth, calculated movements replaced by a frantic, jerking spasm. For a single terrifying second, the entity's form blurred, the temporal distortion field collapsing inward upon itself. It didn't explode. It snapped out of existence, the precise location where it stood suddenly replaced by a gaping dark void in the hull plating that seemed to lead into an impossible depth of space, the super-cold, super-hot air instantly rushing into the vacuum. The final sound Edric heard, before the silence became absolute and the world vanished into searing white heat, was S7's voice, devoid of all inflection, confirming the collapse of the internal threat. Entity neutralization confirmed. Breach integrity 0. However, the catastrophic structural failure associated with the void breach is now irreversible, initiating total quarantine lockdown across all remaining sectors. Good work, Engineer Vaughn. Then, only the sound of his own suit's primary power core failing, collapsing inward as the void claimed the space where the engineer, the collector, and the cooling pipe had been. The blinding white flash subsided, not into darkness, but into a dull, throbbing red glow, reflecting off the residual ice shards clinging to the ruined access shaft. Edric Vaughn was still alive, technically, but the definition of life had narrowed considerably. His suit's internal integrity alarms were silent, having been overloaded into permanent shutdown by the thermal inversion pulse. The air he was currently breathing was stale, hot, and laced with the stench of burnt sealant and his own incinerated protective layers. A bitter perfume of self-destruction. His right leg, frozen solid moments before, now throbbed with a deep, unrelenting agony, the tissue having suffered immediate, massive cellular damage against the backdrop of the entity's catastrophic energy drain. He lay, half-buried in frozen vapor and shredded metal dust. The silence of the void breach itself, an oppressive, total vacuum just meters away, threatening to expand and tear the entire compartment open. The threat of the ordeal was nullified, replaced immediately by the bureaucratic wrath of command and the systemic failure he had engineered. He could feel the heavy, damp weight of his own body, the absolute exhaustion of having fought a two-front war, one against a trans-dimensional scavenger, the other against the dogma of his superiors. He had stopped the contagion, but the station itself was now choking on the aftermath of his desperate maneuver. Habitation Sector 3 was gone. He knew it with the cold certainty of a systems analyst reading a final report. 400 people, silenced because he chose to stop the entity rather than negotiate with a Commander Carlin, who valued an external stalemate over internal stability. A single weak communication channel flickered back to life, bypassing the core network failure and reaching the few operational emergency beacons in the lower engineering decks. The few technicians and engineers who, like him, operated far from the glittering lies of the bridge. Vaughn, this is Rella, Engineer Rella. Do you copy? We are reading catastrophic power segmentation across Gamma and Delta sectors. The central shield harmonics are fluctuating wildly. We're seeing minor thermal bleed-through from the Cathar batteries on external sensors. We've lost visual on the main status board." Rella's voice was frayed, raw, the sound of a person clinging to control by the thread of rote procedure. Edric tried to move his left hand to activate his helmet microphone, but the effort sent tremors of white-hot pain up his arm. He managed a weak, guttural sound, entirely unrecognizable as speech. "S7?" he tried. Nothing. The AI, having spent its final cycles in service to his suicidal gambit, was dark. Edric was utterly alone, trapped beneath the failing superstructure, communicating only through the most rudimentary emergency frequency. A ghost whispering from the engineering bowels of a crippled ship. The physical weight of the defeat settled upon him. It was not the grand, tragic loss of a battle in the void, but the grinding, suffocating defeat of logistics and morale. He had proven that the command structure was flawed, prioritizing the optics of the siege over the actual integrity of the ship. He had saved the system from an external, conceptual horror, the Ordshul, only to be judged for actively causing the localized, tangible catastrophe, the deaths in Sector 3 and the power collapse. In the rigid hierarchy of military survival, saving the whole by sacrificing a part was always debatable. Actively breaking the ship to stop an unseen threat was treason. He focused on the pain in his right leg, letting it anchor him. He had acted not from the glorious defiance Yorick had preached, but from a deep, cold-blooded calculation. The Ordshul was an immediate, terminal threat to existence. Kalen and the sector closures were merely the administrative fallout of his necessary act. But here, in the dark, his logic felt thin, brittle. Had he truly acted to save humanity? Or had he simply chosen the method of destruction that appealed most to his engineer's mindset? The clean severing of a problem, regardless of the collateral cost. He remembered Elsin Bell, railing against misplaced priorities. He had won that intellectual argument by proving the system fatally compromised, but the victory tasted like ash, because the consequence was the silent extinction of hundreds of lives in the upper decks. He had not become a hero. He had become a convenient scapegoat, a necessary casualty to explain the inevitable system failure that would follow. Then, through the static hiss on the emergency frequency, a new sound bled through. A sharp, rhythmic thump, thump, thump. Too precise for structural collapse, too heavy for standard maintenance bots. It was an unauthorized approach, moving against the quarantine protocols he had just initiated. "Rella, do you read that?" Edric forced out, managing to clear his throat enough to produce a strained, agonizing rasp. "Something is coming through the main bulkhead seal in the Gamma Access Junction. Not an external breach, internal pressure lock breach." Rella's response was immediate, thick with terror. "Commander Vaughn, engineer, command just re-established auxiliary power to the bridge. They are demanding immediate status on the localized structural failure. They're calling you the source of the power spike." A pause, and then a choked whisper. "They are sending a security detail to secure the lower decks. Code Red lockdown initiated." The cavalry arrived not to save him, but to neutralize the source of the unpredictable variable. Kalen, now restored to power, was cleaning house. The betrayal was palpable, a physical violation mirroring the structural damage of the station. The rhythmic impact grew louder, closer. Whatever security detail Kalen had dispatched was using high-yield breaching tools against the reinforced bulkheads. Tools that would cause further irreparable stress to the dying superstructure. Edric pushed against the icy debris covering his lower body, managing to free his left hand. He scanned the immediate vicinity. His gaze landed on the emergency toolkit rack, bolted securely to the opposite wall, a rack he had personally secured just cycles before the siege began. His eyes fixed on a single item, a shaped kinetic charge, designated E9, designed for emergency pressure relief on volatile reactor cores. A device far too unstable for standard issue, kept only because Elsin Bell had insisted on its inclusion during the last refit inventory. It was the absolute antithesis of the precise, silent technology of the Orzul entity, the kind of crude, violent force the Cathar had taught humanity to disdain. It was a one-shot device, designed to overload and rupture a containment vessel instantly. He had failed to save the colony from starvation, failed to prevent the immediate deaths in Sector 3, and now he would be executed for ensuring the survival of the system's core infrastructure. His only remaining option was to make his final failure count for something more than just a convenient scapegoat. If Kalen's security detail breached the chamber, they would immediately secure the evidence of the Orzul breach, and more importantly, secure Edric before he could transmit the classified Project Chimera data. He reached for the charge, the cool, dense casing, a stark contrast to the heat radiating from his paralyzed suit. He had minutes, perhaps seconds, before the security team punched through the final lock. He had to gamble that the immediate controlled explosion of the E9 charge, aimed not at the security detail, but at the already weakened hull leading directly into the Cathar blockade field, would be enough to destabilize the quarantine perimeter, forcing the Cathar to react instantly and publicly, thereby drawing attention away from the internal failures. It was an act of open defiance against the Cathar, a calculated provocation that would likely result in the Bastion Prime being vaporized orbitally. But it was the only move left that might force Command to acknowledge the true nature of the threat they had failed to see. He armed the charge, the internal timer ticking down from 60 seconds in stark red digits on the casing. The heavy breaching blows against the nearby access door intensified, the metal groaning a prelude to rupture. Edric braced his good arm against a stable conduit, positioning the volatile charge not toward the door, but toward the weakest section of the outer hull wall nearby, the point where S7 had confirmed the entity's instantaneous vacuum breach had occurred. The final lock gave way with a shattering crack of shearing metal, and 3 heavily armed security enforcers, clad in pristine powered armor that mocked Edric's ruined suit, flooded the freezing smoky chamber, their rifles raised, targeting the only recognizable living anomaly in the wreckage, Engineer Edric Vaughan. "Vaughan, stand down immediately! You are under arrest for unauthorized power diversion and structural sabotage." Commander Kalen's voice, amplified and distorted, boomed from the lead enforcer's external speaker, carrying the unshakable, absolute authority of a man who had just seized control in the name of necessary order. Edric didn't reply. He only looked at the countdown timer flashing 30 seconds. His eyes locked on the 3 figures of compromised authority advancing through the debris, knowing that this desperate, final act would either expose the true war or ensure his immediate silent erasure from the history books as a traitor who broke the ship trying to save it. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The lead enforcer, an imposing silhouette against the emergency red, took a calculated step over a ruptured cooling pipe, his rifle beam sweeping across the devastation that was once a vital engineering nexus. Edric, pinned by the weight of his shattered leg and the debris field, forced his left hand to grip the E9 kinetic charge, its casing cold against his sweat-slicked glove. 20 seconds remained. Final warning, Engineer Vaughn. Drop the ordnance, the enforcer stated, the synthesized cadence of the helmet speaker entirely devoid of human inflection. A mirror image of the detached authority Edric had come to despise. Edric knew the protocol. Drop the charge, be subdued, and the Chimera data, the raw logs proving the Orzul's true nature, and the Cathar's indifference to anything beyond external containment, would be wiped clean by Kalen's automated security sweep before he even reached the brig. The Cathar blockade, the starvation, the deaths in Sector 3, all would officially become the result of one rogue engineer's incompetence. He ignored the approaching trio. His focus narrowed to the stressed bulkhead section near the scorched hull breach, the one place where the physical structure of the Bastion Prime was already compromised. The weak point where the alien scavenger had entered and exited without firing a shot. He wasn't aiming for the security detail. He was aiming for the Cathar's blind spot, the immediate, localized chaos that would force a response beyond their usual passive siege posture. 10 seconds. The enforcers raised their weapons, the targeting lasers snapping onto Edric's chest plate. A final confirmation of Kalen's termination order. Rella! Edric croaked one last time into the dead emergency channel, a gesture to an audience that might not exist. A final, meaningless act of professional documentation. Gamma relay stabilization pending kinetic override insertion. Stand by for external energy pulse. 5 seconds. The nearest enforcer moved to close the distance, clearly intending to tackle him rather than risk an explosive discharge inside the station's guts. Edric flipped the final safety release with his thumb. There was no dramatic shout, no final grand speech, only the cold, precise execution of a necessary demolition. He shoved the E9 charge, not throwing it, but slamming it magnetically against the compromised outer hull plating, and simultaneously initiated the firing sequence. The resulting explosion was not the brilliant focused lance of Cathar energy, nor the searing, hungry white heat of the Orzul. It was a blunt, industrial catastrophe. The E9 detonated with a deafening concussive crump, designed to rupture a reactor containment seal, not a hull. The immediate effect was a localized implosion of air pressure, followed by a shockwave that slammed Edric against the conduit, momentarily driving the breath from his already compromised lungs. The shockwave hit the 3 armored enforcers like a physical fist, throwing them backward in a tangle of sparking, expensive armor, their rifles skittering across the deck plating. But the primary effect was on the external environment. The already weakened hull section, stressed by the ghost vacuum of the Orzul's passage, gave way entirely. Instead of vacuum sucking inward, the intense, focused kinetic energy punched outward, breaching the station's remaining layers of shielding and venting the core engineering section's remaining atmosphere directly towards the Cathar blockade line. The effect on the alien fleet was instantaneous and entirely unexpected. For months the Cathar had maintained their perfect silent formation, an immovable object against human resilience. Now, their periphery suddenly registered a massive localized energy signature. Not a weapon discharge, but an uncontrolled expulsion of station matter. A breach of quarantine on a scale that suggested immediate catastrophic self-destruction. The reaction was terrifying in its suddenness. Where there had been an ocean of black punctuated by cold crystalline lights, there was now furious alien motion, long skeletal appendages, defensive drones or automated interceptors never before deployed, unfurled from the massive shapes. They moved with bewildering speed, not firing upon the Bastion Prime, but sweeping the immediate void surrounding the breach point, analyzing the debris plume, attempting to quarantine the escape of whatever raw energy or biological matter had just been ejected. Edric, dazed, heard Rella's voice screaming over the emergency channel, no longer laced with fear, but with stark, disbelieving awe. "Vaughn, the Cathar are reacting. They're deploying kinetic nets. They are treating this like a full contamination event. Commander Kalen is ordering a full shield power diversion to reinforce the hull section." The attempt to reinforce the hull was too late. The E9 charge had achieved what months of defiance could not. It had broken the Cathar passive neutrality. They were no longer observing a siege. They were containing a biological spill. Edric pushed himself up, ignoring the searing agony in his leg, the movement sending fresh waves of nausea through him. The security detail was stirring, their sophisticated armor sputtering as the debris and localized atmospheric loss interfered with their delicate internal systems. The lead enforcer was struggling to regain his rifle, his movements sluggish. "Chimera data access! Now!" Edric gasped, recognizing the narrow window. The Cathar's overwhelming reaction had diverted all primary sensor focus and computational power away from local security protocols. Kalen's grip on the internal systems was momentarily weakened, focused entirely on managing the incoming alien response. Using his good leg, Edric scrambled toward the nearest intact access terminal, a relic from the pre-siege refit that Elsin Bell had insisted on keeping, arguing that its obsolete analog interface was the only thing immune to high-level intrusion. He slammed his hand onto the manual override panel. The screen flickered to life, displaying the internal command structure. Kalen's centralized control, now momentarily throttled by external crisis. Edric forced his fingers across the physical keys, initiating the transfer sequence for the Chimera logs, the proof to the only external relay still believed functional. A deep space emergency beacon, positioned outside the immediate blockade zone, accessible only through a forgotten maintenance uplink. It was a long shot, relying on archaic protocols and blind luck. The data stream began. Slow, agonizingly slow, measured in kilobytes, while the external threat metrics flashed red across the screen. The Cathar nets were closing in on the venting area. Orbital impact probability spiked from 0.00 to 20% within 60 seconds. The security enforcer finally recovered, his rifle now leveled steady, his voice regaining its metallic certainty. "Transfer terminated. Vaughn, you have initiated an act of systemic warfare against a superior entity. You will be neutralized immediately." The enforcer fired. Not a full blast, but a focused kinetic stun pulse, designed to incapacitate without destroying key infrastructure. A protocol designed to retrieve valuable detainees, not execute traitors. The pulse struck Edric square in the chest. The impact was brutal, less a shock and more a sudden, complete system shutdown. His vision fractured into sharp, chaotic lines of red and black. His arm spasmed violently, yanking the transfer cable loose from the port. The data transfer halted at 82% completion. Edric collapsed fully onto the deck, the agony in his leg now a distant, background hum to the electrical fire raging through his nervous system. He watched, dimly aware, as the lead enforcer moved to secure the damaged data cable, effectively stopping the transmission. The immediate danger, the internal threat of Kaelin's judgment, had been successfully distracted by the Cathar's aggressive response to the external breach. Edric had bought the station time, perhaps even saved it from total systemic collapse by forcing the alien fleet to engage defensively. But the cost was absolute. The security team began applying restraint cuffs, cold metal biting into his wrist where the kinetic pulse had seized his muscles. As they moved to drag him away from the terminal, Rella's voice crackled one last time, faint but clear, no longer ecstatic about the Cathar's panic, but steeped in dread. "Engineer Vaughn, Command is overriding the shield diversion. They are prioritizing defense against you. They are venting the remaining atmosphere in the lower maintenance sectors, the sectors housing the emergency escape pods. They're sealing off the exit routes. They're locking down the station against internal movement." Edric looked up through the haze of electrical feedback, meeting the impassive visor of the enforcer leaning over him. He had managed to break the external siege's stagnation, forcing the Cathar to acknowledge them. He had exposed the lie that kept the colony docile. He had failed only in the final, crucial milliseconds of data transfer. He was alive, but he was captured, isolated in the dying bowels of a fortress that was now actively turning against its own survivors, the threat of external annihilation replaced by the calculated, cold-blooded purge of its administrative overseers. He managed one last ragged breath of stale, recycled air. The metallic tang of desperation now mixed with the sharp, clean scent of ozone from his own fried nervous system. Beyond the tortured bulkheads, the relentless, patient light of the Cathar blockade remained, waiting for the internal fever to break so they could return to their long, silent siege. The impact faded first, not with a bang, but with the systemic failure of pain receptors struggling to interpret the overwhelming surge of energy. The emergency red lighting, which had pulsed with the rhythm of panic for cycles, sputtered into a weak, unreliable amber. Struggling against the diversion of power Elsin Bell's archaic systems had failed to anticipate. The cacophony, the alarms, the panicked shout of Rella, the crunch of metal, retreated, swallowed by a silence so profound it felt pressurized. Edric Vaughn lay on the deck plating, the cold seeping through the compromised armor, a geological feature in the wreckage. The enforcers moved with a renewed, chilling efficiency. The stun pulse had not killed him, but it had achieved the administrative goal: incapacitation without rendering the asset useless for trial. They worked quickly, efficiently stripping the damaged kinetic charge from the hull, prioritizing the removal of evidence over the stabilization of the atmospheric breach. 82%. The failure stung deeper than the physical trauma. 82% of the data package detailing the Ordrel's true purpose, The existential horror deliberately shielded from the populace to maintain order during the siege was now adrift in the void, transmitted to a beacon beyond the Cathar's immediate consideration. The remaining 18%, the evidence of Commander Kaelin's collaboration and complicity, remained locked within the Bastion primes. Scorched core memory banks, accessible only to the very regime that had just ordered his execution. The cuffs clamped around his wrists were heavier than standard issue, locking his arms rigidly behind his back. As they hauled him upright, his shattered leg offered no resistance, dangling uselessly, a dead weight dragging across the grid and shattered circuitry. He saw the lead enforcer pause by the terminal, not to check the transfer status, but to wipe the greasy fingerprints from the casing. Procedure over consequence. Rella's final transmission, now just a ghost in the dead comms unit, hung heavy in his mind. They're locking down the station against internal movement. They had been fighting the Cathar for 6 cycles, sacrificing logistics, nutrition, and morality in a protracted, grinding war of attrition against the silent crystalline enemy outside. But when Edric forced that external crisis, the controlled venting of the station's guts, the internal structure of command, the Cowlan administration had revealed its true immediate threat. The enemy was not the one waiting patiently in the void. It was the one ensuring no one else knew how, why they were waiting. They dragged him through the engineering access tunnels, now dark, the emergency lights extinguished entirely as power was funneled upward to reinforce the orbital shields against the Cathar's defensive deployment. The temperature was dropping rapidly. The sickeningly sweet alien odor that had accompanied the Orzel's passage was gone, replaced by the sterile, biting chill of deep space vacuum bleeding into the station's circulatory system. He passed the junction leading to Sector Gamma. The hyper-relay coils, stripped of their cryo-coolant, were already failing catastrophically. Not a violent explosion, but a slow systemic seizure. A tremor ran through the deck beneath his good boot, a deep, resonant moan of stressed titanium, the sound of the station beginning to tear itself apart, not from Cathar assault, but from internal physics demanding equilibrium. He was taken to the brig level, a section sealed off entirely during the siege, supposedly reserved for political dissidents or high-level sabotage suspects. Now it was the staging area for administrative cleansing. The reinforced durasteel door hissed open, and they deposited him roughly onto the deck of a holding cell. The door cycled shut with a heavy, final thunk, severing the ambient noise of the engineering teams scrambling above. Edric slumped against the cold wall, his body a landscape of electrical burns and fractured bone. He was alone. The Cathar blockade remained, an indifferent constant. The 70% of the population still alive within the core sectors would continue their starved routine, believing the crisis had passed, that the necessary sacrifices had been made to survive the external threat. Kaelan would issue a decree, citing a temporary surge in localized system failures, and the surviving records would reflect Engineer Vaughan's untimely demise due to structural collapse during the crisis. The Chimera data, 82% revealed, would become an unconfirmable rumor whispered in maintenance shafts. He closed his eyes, the darkness behind his lids now more profound than the external gloom. He thought back to the very start, the sensory input that anchored his existence before the blockade, the metallic pressure of the restraint clamp on his forearm during his initial inspection, the sharp bite against the dull exhaustion of endless maintenance checks. That pressure, he realized, was the true baseline of existence in this corner of the galaxy. The constant, uncomfortable physical reminder that you were restrained, that your movement was permitted only within the parameters set by those with greater authority, whether they were Cathar warships or the administrators above him. He opened his eyes again, staring at his own hands, hands that had struggled to hold systems together and failed only at the last second. The cold was absolute now, penetrating the heavy armor layers. He was one man, deep within the bowels of a dying fortress, a necessary liability erased by the regime he had tried, clumsily, to save. The Cathar waited for the station to exhaust its resources. Kalen's command waited for the station to exhaust its inconvenient memories. And Edric Vaughn waited for the slow, inevitable equalization of pressure, the final, perfect thermodynamic balance that would quiet the noise of all defiance. The magnetic restraint clamp bit into his forearm, a ghost pressure now, infinitely colder than the metal that had once held him tight, the only physical connection left to the structure that was finally giving way around him. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an, abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.